The story began not with a scream, but with a whisper swallowed by the unrelenting fog of western Washington in the early 1980s. This was the Pacific Northwest, a land defined by its deep, saturated blues and forest greens, where ancient stands of Douglas fir marched down impossible slopes, their crowns perpetually shrouded in moisture, only to abruptly give way to the frantic asphalt sprawl of burgeoning suburbs and the restless docks of Seattle and Tacoma. It was a region of spectacular, crushing beauty, layered directly atop gritty urban desperation. The air tasted of salt, pine, and diesel exhaust. At the geographic and emotional heart of the unfolding horror lay the Green River, a vein of icy, unforgiving water. It coiled for more than 60 miles through King County, a relentless current carving its way through old logging trails, dairy farms, and the backsides of newly paved subdivisions. The river itself was a powerful entity, beautiful and deadly, an indifferent witness to human activity. Along this frigid waterway, particularly near the major interchanges and the edges of the port cities, life existed in the literal shadows. These shadows were inhabited by the most fragile of souls, the invisible cohort whom polite society preferred not to acknowledge. Young runaways who had fled broken homes for the promise of the city lights, individuals wrestling with the crushing grip of addiction, and women forced to navigate the precarious economy of street corners and late-night bars to survive. They lived precariously, existing on the margins where anonymity was both their shield and their fatal vulnerability. They were frequently transients, moving targets whose sudden absence rarely triggered immediate alarm bells. A girl could disappear from a motel parking lot or a truck stop without so much as a missing persons report being filed for weeks, sometimes months. Their marginalization, their tragic, profound lack of stable ties, created a hunting ground of devastating perfection for a predator who understood that silence was the greatest ally. For a chillingly long period, the disappearances were cataloged as inevitable casualties of a risky lifestyle, as voluntary departures, girls simply moving on to the next town or succumbing to their own demons. No one connected the dots because few bothered to look at the individual dots closely enough. The official narrative was one of societal attrition, not malice. The monster was operating hidden in plain sight, exploiting the chasm between the sprawling metropolis and the deep, silent woods. He moved through the periphery, taking advantage of the vastness of the geography and the smallness of the public's concern. The river offered him cover, a 60-mile disposal chute that ran through the most isolated and forgotten pockets of the county. The victims were deemed irrelevant. Their fate, it was implicitly assumed, was self-inflicted. But the Green River, for all its icy indifference, was not a willing accomplice. Though it flowed powerfully toward the Puget Sound, carrying debris and secrets alike, the water would not hold its counsel forever. The dense moss and tangled undergrowth along its banks offered shelter to the killer's actions, but the powerful hydraulic forces of the Pacific Northwest winter and summer runoff guaranteed that eventually the river would begin to speak, pushing the terrible evidence of human depravity back toward the light. The time for dismissing the missing had ended. The water was about to tell its story. The cold, wide expanse of the Green River had been complicit in silence for too long, swallowing secrets deep into the mud and fast-moving currents, its banks cloaked in the indifferent density of the fir forests. That silence shattered on a nondescript midsummer day in 1982. The witnesses were two young girls cycling along a secluded, forested stretch of the riverbank near Auburn, a mundane, innocent pursuit suddenly colliding with unimaginable horror. They spotted something snagged near a thick eddy, not quite trash, not quite a submerged log. As they approached, the shape coalesced into the horrifying reality of a human form, bloated and disfigured by the unforgiving cold water. When the King County Sheriff's deputies arrived, the scene was documented with grim, urgent efficiency. The victim was quickly identified as Wedini Caulfield, a known face in the late-night haunts and bars of Seattle and Tacoma, a young woman navigating the treacherous, vulnerable edges of the street economy to survive. The forensic evidence was undeniable. This was a violent crime, marked by severe contusions, distinct ligature marks circling her throat, and deep internal trauma. Investigators initially filed the case away as a tragic, isolated incident, a brutal consequence, they reasoned, of the victim's high-risk lifestyle. It was categorized as a singular tragedy, the kind of brutal end that sometimes accompanied the darkness of the city's underbelly, an event destined, they expected, to be quickly forgotten by the wider public. However, the illusion of singularity lasted precisely 1 month.
On August 12, 1985, the river yielded a second corpse, demanding that the authorities re-examine the Caulfield case with fresh terror. 4 miles downstream from where the first body had been discovered, the body of Deborah Lynn Bonner, 23 years old, was recovered. She was another young woman struggling against addiction and poverty, another casualty of the streets, another soul whose absence had gone largely unnoticed until the river forced her presence back into the world. The detectives tasked with processing the second scene felt the sudden, crushing weight of dread. The similarities were too precise, too chilling to be accidental. Bonner, like Caulfield, had suffered a severe physical assault. Bonner, like Caulfield, had been strangled. And crucially, both women shared the same sad, precarious existence on the margins of society before their bodies were abandoned to the cold, flowing water. The immediate, horrifying conclusion snapped into focus. This was not coincidence. This was a deliberate, systematic pattern. A single killer was stalking the most vulnerable women who frequented the highway interchanges and late-night establishments of King County, using the Green River, its vastness, its remoteness, its inherent ability to conceal, as his personal dumping ground. The river had begun to tell its story, and it was a catalog of systematic, calculated brutality, announcing the presence of a predator who saw these marginalized lives not as people, but as invisible targets for a lethal game. The shadows of the Pacific Northwest now held a tangible, lethal threat, one that was only just beginning its devastating escalation. The illusion of singularity shattered just 3 days after Deborah Lynn Bonner's body was recovered. The community, still reeling from the realization that 2 marginal lives had been violently extinguished in the same calculated manner, was forced to confront an escalating nightmare. On August 1982, the river yielded more secrets, this time with a horrifying degree of calculation. A man paddling a canoe, navigating the thick, muddy bends of the Green, discovered a gruesome tableau: not 1, but 2 female bodies, partially submerged near a shallow embankment. The immediate discovery was sickening enough, but what chilled the responding deputies to the bone was the disposal method. These victims had not simply been tossed into the current. They had been meticulously weighted down with stones and concrete chunks, clearly bound by rope in a deliberate attempt to ensure the cold water claimed them permanently. The killer was evolving, moving from reckless dumping to precise, methodical erasure. The police dragnet immediately expanded, the grim certainty of a prolific serial offender settling like the perpetual fog over the Puget Sound region. The discovery of the bound bodies confirmed the pattern, but the searchers, now swarming the dense, claustrophobic woods and undergrowth lining the riverbanks, soon found proof of the killer's sickening productivity. Not far from where the weighted victims lay, deep within a thicket of tangled blackberry bushes and cedar saplings, investigators stumbled upon a 5th body. This victim had been crudely hidden, a pathetic attempt at camouflage that suggested haste or perhaps an added layer of sadistic indifference. She was found partially clothed, brutally strangled, the ligature marks indicating she had been choked with incredible force, possibly using her own clothing, the stiff denim of her jeans. Within hours, the grim task of identification began, cementing the unifying, tragic theme of the case. The weighted bodies were identified as Cynthia Hines, a young woman known to frequent the streets of Seattle, and Marcia Chapman, another victim who struggled with addiction and poverty. The 5th victim, found tossed in the bushes, was Opal Mills, a heartbreakingly young 16-year-old runaway. 5 lives, extinguished with brutal efficiency, all sharing a common thread of vulnerability. They were the invisible women of the Pacific Northwest, living on the precarious edges of society, whose disappearances typically generated little more than a perfunctory paper trail. Now, through death, they had achieved a terrifying unified visibility. The speed of the escalation, 5 victims within a few short weeks, all linked to the same waterway and the same violent modus operandi, confirmed that King County was facing a crisis of unparalleled magnitude. Sheriff's resources were strained to the breaking point. This was no longer a localized tragedy, it was a metropolitan catastrophe demanding a massive, unified response.
Recognizing the extraordinary nature of the threat, the department formed the Green River Task Force, a specialized unit comprising detectives and patrol officers tasked with a single, harrowing goal: finding the monster who was using the river as his personal graveyard. The GRKTF headquarters, rapidly established in a temporary space, buzzed with frustrated energy.
Maps of the Green River winding its way through Kent, Auburn, and Renton were plastered on the walls, marked with grim red pins showing the recovery sites. The investigators pored over the details, the consistency of the strangulation, the commonality in the victims' lives, the disturbing shift in disposal techniques. The river, once a picturesque feature of the region, had been forever marked. It was no longer simply the Green River. It was now the repository of a ghoul's horrifying legacy, the dark, damp signature of a killer who preyed on those least likely to be missed, transforming the vast, misty wilderness into a highly calculated hunting ground. The Green River Killer, the chilling moniker that would define a generation of fear, had announced his terrifying arrival. The discovery of the clustered bodies near the Green River shattered the facade of isolated tragedies and forced the King County Sheriff's Office into a state of emergency. The river, once a picturesque landmark defining the boundary between urban sprawl and wilderness, was now the notorious epicenter of unprecedented carnage. Investigators realized with sickening certainty that they were dealing not with opportunistic violence, but with a highly organized, systematic predator, a serial killer of a magnitude the region had never experienced. The pressure was immediate and crushing. Public hysteria mounted as the media seized on the moniker, the Green River Killer. To manage the escalating crisis and the deluge of leads, most of them useless, the authorities formed the Green River Killer Task Force. Their headquarters quickly became a chaotic, smoke-filled warren housed in a converted warehouse in the South King County suburbs. Maps of the entire 60-mile stretch of the river, meticulously marked with the locations of the 5 known victims, were plastered across every available wall, connected by crisscrossing red strings that painted a terrifying mosaic of death. Detectives, drawn from various county and city forces, worked 18-hour shifts fueled by lukewarm coffee and shared dread. They were disciplined, professional, and entirely overwhelmed by the speed and brutality of the attacks. The sheer volume of potential suspects, men who frequented the areas where the victims worked, men with records of violence against women, was staggering. The task force needed a way to break the pattern, to understand the psychological framework of the killer. In a move born out of utter desperation and a profound sense of moral nausea, the KCSO made the decision that would haunt many of the detectives involved for years. They would seek counsel from the area's last great monster, Ted Bundy. Bundy, residing on Florida's death row, was a paradox, a charming, articulate psychopath whose intimate knowledge of predatory behavior was undeniable. He had hunted in these very forests, operated in these same urban shadows. The detectives, swallowing their deep-seated revulsion, made the pilgrimage. The meeting took place in a sterile, low-lit visiting room, a world away from the perpetual damp and dark green of Western Washington. Bundy, outwardly calm and analytical, received the details of the Green River murders. He listened intently to the profiles of the marginalized victims, the runaways and the street workers, and the calculated manner in which they were disposed of, often submerged or hidden with brutal efficiency. Then Bundy spoke, his voice chillingly clinical, offering a window into the mind of a kindred spirit. He confirmed the obvious: the killer was highly intelligent and deeply narcissistic. But his most crucial piece of advice focused not on the victims, but on the crime scenes themselves. "He is returning to them," Bundy stated simply, leaning forward with unnerving intensity. "You are focusing on where he takes them. You must focus on where he returns." Bundy elaborated on the compulsion of certain offenders to revisit the dump sites. For the killer, the location wasn't just a place to discard evidence, it was a sanctuary, a monument to his power. Returning allowed him to relive the act, to bask in his secret mastery over the police and the victims. It was a macabre form of gratification, a need to ensure his trophies remained undisturbed, or simply to revel in the lingering sense of his achievement. The detectives absorbed the analysis in grim silence. Despite their visceral hatred for the source, they could not dismiss the insight. It made a horrifying, warped kind of sense. The killer wasn't just disposing of bodies, he was cultivating a relationship with the death sites. Acting immediately on Bundy's sinister counsel, the GRKTF launched a vast, covert surveillance operation. Teams of plainclothes officers were deployed to stake out every known dump site and many suspected locations along the desolate, fog-shrouded riverbanks. Hiding among the dense, dripping fir trees, they endured endless cold, the pervasive smell of stagnant water and pine needles, and the unnerving quiet of the isolated woods, waiting for a vehicle, perhaps the rumored red pickup truck, to approach in the dead of night. They waited for weeks, then months. The terrain itself became the enemy. The Pacific Northwest wilderness was too vast, too dense, and too prone to impenetrable fog and rain. An area spanning dozens of square miles of unforgiving forest offered too many access points, too much cover. The slightest sound of a twig snapping could be a deer, a raccoon, or the killer, and often it was nothing at all. The surveillance failed. The Green River Killer, if he did revisit his scenes, was either too patient, too lucky, or too keenly aware of police procedures to be detected. The initial momentum of the investigation stalled, leaving the GRKTF exhausted, frustrated, and psychologically bruised. They had played the killer's game on his turf and lost. The monster remained concealed, now perhaps empowered by the knowledge that even an operation of this magnitude could not pin him down. The river continued its relentless flow, cold and indifferent, swallowing secrets while the police watched the wrong shadows. The hunt had begun in earnest, but the hunter was invisible, protected by the sprawling geography of the Pacific Northwest and the limits of 1980s forensic capability. The dark period was only just beginning. The year 1983 brought not clarity, but an agonizing deluge of death. The Green River Task Force, initially energized by its formation, was quickly overwhelmed. The victims were now being found at an alarming rate, not just in the river, but deliberately hidden in the dense, thorny scrubland miles away, scattered from Federal Way to Seattle. It became devastatingly clear that the killer was diversifying his dump sites, employing callous strategies to decompose the bodies quickly or simply render them nearly impossible to find. For the detectives, this period was a demoralizing grind, a constant stream of gruesome recoveries, frantic family interviews, and endless, fruitless stakeouts inspired by Bundy's haunting advice. The killer, seemingly enjoying his freedom, had accelerated his pace, turning the Pacific Northwest into his personal hunting ground. It was amidst this suffocating darkness that a faint but crucial sliver of light appeared. Several witnesses from the area's notorious Highway 99 corridor, the prime territory where the vulnerable young women saw trade, recalled seeing many of the missing girls getting into the same vehicle, an older, reddish-orange Ford pickup truck, often described as muddy or well-used. It was an unremarkable vehicle, precisely the kind that would blend seamlessly into the working-class landscape of Tacoma and South King County. But it was a lead, the first solid physical link to the predator's movements. Detectives meticulously cross-referenced vehicle registrations and previous police contacts in the areas of the disappearances. The trail led them to Gary Leon Ridgway, a 34-year-old local truck painter who worked at a Kenworth plant near the Green River. On paper, Ridgway was the picture of banality, married, employed, and living a deceptively normal suburban life. Yet, he had a documented history of frequenting the same red-light districts where the victims had worked. He was brought in for questioning, a moment that would later be viewed as one of the most tragic missed opportunities in American criminal history. In the interrogation room, Ridgway was remarkably composed. He was cooperative, even amiable, offering polite denials to every question regarding the missing girls. The detectives, seasoned veterans of human deception, felt the cold certainty of his guilt, the chilling lack of visible anxiety that often characterizes a seasoned psychopath. Despite their instincts, they lacked hard evidence. They pressed him, focusing on the circumstantial links between his truck, his known habits, and the victims' disappearances. Ridgway maintained his innocence with a quiet, almost boring conviction. Frustrated but needing to either confirm their suspicions or move on, the task force administered a polygraph test, the technological arbiter of truth in the 1980s. The polygraph examiner, relying on the limited, imperfect technology of the time, reviewed the charts. The resulting analysis was disastrous for the investigation. Gary Ridgway passed. Or, more accurately, the test was deemed inconclusive but insufficient to establish grounds for his immediate arrest or further detention. The task force, bound by protocol and the perceived veracity of the test, had no choice but to release their prime suspect. The decision, though mandated by the science available, felt like a betrayal of every victim already lost. The failure to detain Ridgway was a catastrophe that instantly emboldened the killer. He had been scrutinized and released. He knew the police had looked at him and failed to see the monster standing before them. The killer's next act was a chilling, public display of mockery aimed directly at the authorities. A few short months after Ridgway's release, yet another victim was discovered, her body left in a spot that was calculated to ensure discovery. Beside her, deliberately placed, was a meticulously cut-out article from a local newspaper about the ongoing investigation, titled "The Green River Killer." It was a triumphant signature, a terrifying confirmation that the killer was not just watching the hunt, he was participating in the game, enjoying the agonizing frustration of the men and women tasked with stopping him. He was proving that the system had failed, and he was now free to continue his work unhindered, having been given a license to kill by the very investigation designed to stop him. The trail of the red pickup truck led directly to Gary Leon Ridgway, a 34-year-old local automotive painter whose unremarkable life belied the disturbing pattern of his casual encounters in the shadowy nexus of Highway 99. When the task force brought him in for questioning, they felt the cautious surge of anticipation. He fit the profile, a local man, familiar with the geography of the Green River Corridor and possessing a history of minor arrests related to public indecency, suggesting a repressed deviance that might escalate. Ridgway was cooperative, unnervingly so. He projected an aura of bland, blue-collar normalcy, polite, soft-spoken, and seemingly bewildered by the attention. When confronted with the allegations, he maintained an absolute, steady denial. The detectives, trusting their gut instincts honed by decades of dealing with deceptive individuals, felt certain they had their man. But in the 1980s, police procedure often prioritized technological benchmarks over human intuition, and the most damning procedural hurdle placed before them was the polygraph examination. The lie detector test was administered meticulously. Ridgway said in the small fluorescent-lit room, wires wrapped around his chest and fingers, his breathing and skin conductivity monitored as the questions were posed, simple, direct, existential queries about the murders and the victims. The needle danced, the charts recorded, and when the test concluded, the resulting analysis delivered a devastating verdict. Gary Ridgway was telling the truth. The cold weight of protocol settled upon the investigation like a shroud. To the men and women of the task force, who had spent months immersed in the grim geography of the river and the desperation of the victims, the mechanical reading was a grotesque betrayal. They knew he was lying. Their collective experience screamed it. Yet, lacking any hard forensic evidence that technology could currently link to him, and facing the conclusive report of the polygraph, they were legally and procedurally cornered. The investigation was forced to classify Ridgway as a cleared suspect, or at best, an individual of minimal continued interest. This decision was perhaps the most catastrophic failure of the entire initial investigation. By honoring the flawed technology of the time, the task force had inadvertently ratified the innocence of a deeply organized, manipulative psychopath. Gary Ridgway walked free, returning to his suburban life, his job, and his quiet, deadly obsession with the women of the Pacific Northwest. The release was not merely an administrative mistake, it was the removal of the cage door, allowing the monster to resume his hunt with renewed confidence. The immediate aftermath was chilling evidence of the mistake. The killer, sensing the reprieve and recognizing his successful evasion, became emboldened, theatrical even. The killings, which had momentarily slowed under the intense scrutiny of the early task force formation, began again with renewed, savage intensity. But the next discovery carried a message far beyond the violence inflicted upon the victim. A new body was found, dumped near a popular stretch of the Green River that investigators had been meticulously monitoring. The victim, another young woman marginalized by society, had been brutally strangled. This discovery, however, was accompanied by a calculated act of defiance designed to mock the failure of the task force. Near the victim's left hand, partially hidden beneath a scattering of damp leaves, was a small folded piece of newsprint. When the lead detective carefully unfolded the soggy paper, the message was stark. It was a clipping from a recent issue of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, or the Seattle Times, specifically detailing the police's escalating frustration and their desperate attempts to capture the perpetrator, naming him plainly the Green River Killer. The inclusion of the newspaper clipping was a cold, unambiguous declaration of psychological warfare. It confirmed that the killer was not merely a random predator. He was an active spectator of the investigation, monitoring the media coverage, delighting in the fear he generated, and fully aware of the police's fruitless efforts. He had just successfully lied his way out of custody, and now he was publicly celebrating his untouchability, using the victim's body as the stage for his contemptuous performance. This calculated display of hubris solidified the terrifying profile of the man they were hunting. He was not desperate or clumsy. He was meticulous, highly organized, and possessed a chilling degree of narcissistic enjoyment in his power over both his victims and the agencies tasked with stopping him. The river had become his personalized hunting grounds, and now the headlines were his scoreboard. The task force, reeling from the internal betrayal of the polygraph and the external provocation of the clipping, realized they were facing an enemy who was not just deadly, but actively savoring the prolonged cat-and-mouse game. The Green River Killer had proven that he could hide in plain sight, and until science got up with the scope of his depravity, he would remain an unseen shadow in the rain-soaked wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. Sau khi màn khiêu khích trơ trẽn của kẻ giết người khép lại giai đoạn hoạt động tích cực nhất, một hiện tượng thậm chí còn đáng lo ngại hơn đã xuất hiện, sự im lặng. Sau năm 1987, số lượng thi thể xuất hiện đã giảm đáng kể. Đội đặc nhiệm sông Green lúc đầu còn cảm thấy nhẹ nhõm, nhanh chóng nhận ra đây không phải là một chiến thắng mà là một sự rút lui có tính toán. Tên sát nhân không hề biến mất, hắn chỉ đơn giản là đã học được sự thận trọng. Sự giám sát gắt gao của truyền thông và sự gia tăng hiện diện của cảnh sát với các sĩ quan chìm lượn lờ tại các đường cao tốc và khu vực đèn đỏ đã buộc kẻ săn mồi phải chuyển sang trạng thái ngủ đông hoặc có thể di chuyển ra khỏi khu vực cụ thể này, đi về phía bắc hướng tới các vùng ngoại ô vô danh của Seattle và Tacoma, nơi hắn có thể săn mồi trong các khu vực ít được tổ chức hơn. Mặc dù các vụ giết người có hệ thống đã chấm dứt, cuộc điều tra vẫn không bao giờ thực sự khép lại. Đội đặc nhiệm, dù đã bị thu hẹp quy mô và hoạt động như một nhóm cốt cán, vẫn bị ám ảnh bởi những lần suýt bắt được hung thủ. Họ duy trì hồ sơ về các nghi phạm trình, nhưng không ai khiến họ bực bội và khó nắm bắt hơn Gary Leon Ridgway. Người đàn ông này có lịch sử tiếp xúc với các cô gái làm việc đường phố, chiếc xe bán tải màu đỏ trùng khớp với lời khai và đã có mặt tại những khu vực săn mồi. Tuy nhiên, chiếc máy kiểm tra nói dối, một công nghệ chủ quan, dễ sai lầm của thập niên 80, đã tuyên bố hắn vô tội, buộc các thám tử phải loại bỏ hắn khỏi danh sách truy bắt tích cực. Trong giai đoạn bế tắc này, các thám tử đã có một tầm nhìn xa quan trọng. Họ hiểu rằng họ đang chiến đấu với một tên sát nhân hiện đại bằng những công cụ đã lỗi thời. Họ biết rằng khoa học pháp y, đặc biệt là lĩnh vực định danh DNA mới nổi, cuối cùng sẽ cách mạng hóa việc điều tra tội phạm. Hy vọng duy nhất của họ là bảo đảm tương lai sinh học của vụ án. Vào năm 1987, dưới chiêu bài rà soát lại hành chính tất cả các nghi phạm đang hoạt động để thu thập thông tin nhận dạng cập nhật, một thủ tục quan liêu thoạt nhìn có vẻ vô hại, các thám tử đã khéo léo thu thập được thứ mà họ thực sự cần. Ridgway được yêu cầu cung cấp các mẫu vật mới, vài sợi tóc được cắt gọn gàng và một mẫu nước bọt từ miệng. Tự tin vào sự thành công của mình với máy kiểm tra nói dối trước đó và tin rằng yêu cầu này chỉ là một thủ tục phiền phức tiêu chuẩn, nghi phạm đã dễ dàng tuân thủ. Những phong bì quý giá chứa đựng thông tin sinh học đó đã được dán nhãn, lập danh mục và niêm phong cẩn thận. Chúng không có giá trị sử dụng ngay lập tức. Công nghệ DNA của năm 1987 đòi hỏi các mẫu vật còn nguyên vẹn, giàu số lượng mà những bằng chứng đã bị phân hủy, cũ kỹ tại hiện trường không thể cung cấp được. Các mẫu vật của Ridgway được giao cho phòng lạnh sâu của kho bằng chứng, một nhà xác tạm thời cho sự thật tiềm năng. 5 tháng trôi qua thành thập kỷ, hồ sơ vụ án phủ đầy bụi. Đội đặc nhiệm sông Green giải thể rồi lại được tái lập. Họ theo đuổi những manh mối ma quái và những đầu mối bế tắc, luôn tìm kiếm một mô hình mà kẻ giết người đã ngừng tạo ra. Trong khi đó, Ridgway tiếp tục cuộc sống của mình, làm công việc thợ sơn xe hơi tẻ nhạt, trở về nhà với vợ, thỉnh thoảng đi ngang qua chính những thám tử đang nắm giữ vận mệnh của hắn được đóng băng trong một phong bì. Hắn là một người đàn ông vô hình, được bảo vệ không phải bằng sự thông minh của chính mình, mà bằng khoảng cách thời gian giữa tội ác và khoa học. Nỗi đau đớn của vụ án chuyển thành sự thất vọng âm ỉ, lặng lẽ. Hệ thống đã thất bại với các nạn nhân của thập niên 80, nhưng trong giới hạn vô trùng, đóng băng của kho bằng chứng, một lời hứa vẫn còn đó. Công lý cho những người phụ nữ sông Green không hề bị từ chối, nó chỉ đang chờ đợi bước tiến không thể ngăn cản của công nghệ để cuối cùng bắt kịp với nỗi kinh hoàng đã xảy ra. Sự im lặng bao trùm sau năm 1987 không phải là hòa bình mà là sự giễu cợt kéo dài. Kẻ giết người sông Green không biến mất, hắn chỉ đơn giản là đã rút lui vào bóng tối, có lẽ là do sự tăng cường giám sát của đội đặc nhiệm sông Green và áp lực chưa từng có lên các khu vực đèn đỏ. Các thám tử đã sống trong cảm giác buồn nôn rằng họ đã để sống một con quái vật, một kẻ đã cướp đi sinh mạng của hàng chục phụ nữ, và giờ đây, hắn đang ẩn mình trong tầm mắt thường, tiếp tục cuộc sống bình thường của mình. Nhiều năm trôi qua, vụ án đi vào bế tắc đau đớn. Bằng chứng vật lý đã được thu thập là rất lớn, nhưng đa số chúng bị phân hủy, bị hủy hoại do nước hoặc bị ô nhiễm bởi các yếu tố môi trường của rừng rậm Tây Washington. Phương pháp điều tra truyền thống đã chạm đến giới hạn, các cuộc phỏng vấn không dẫn đến đâu, các cuộc rình rập không mang lại kết quả, và sự mệt mỏi đã ăn sâu vào tâm hồn các thám tử tận tụy nhất. Trong môi trường tuyệt vọng này, những người đứng đầu GRKTF bắt đầu xem xét một chiến lược mới, đặt cược vào tương lai. Đây là giữa thập niên 80 và khoa học pháp y đang ở giai đoạn sơ khai của cuộc cách mạng DNA. Các kỹ thuật tiên tiến nhất như RFLP bắt đầu được thảo luận, nhưng chúng vẫn còn quá tốn kém, quá nhạy cảm với sự xuống cấp của mẫu vật và chưa được tòa án chấp nhận rộng rãi để trở thành công cụ chủ đạo. Tuy nhiên, các thám tử nhận ra một sự thật nghiệt ngã, nếu họ không thể bắt Gary Leon Ridgway bằng các công cụ của thập niên 80, họ cần phải đảm bảo rằng công nghệ của thập niên 90 hoặc 2000 sẽ làm được điều đó. Ridgway, người đã vượt qua bài kiểm tra nói dối năm 1983, vẫn là một cái gai trong lòng họ. Sự phủ nhận bình tĩnh của hắn, lịch sử tiếp xúc với các nạn nhân và chiếc xe bán tải màu đỏ trùng khớp với một số lời khai ít ỏi đã giữ hắn ở đầu danh sách nghi phạm tiềm năng. Nhưng không có bằng chứng trực tiếp nào, không có lời thú tội nào, và đặc biệt là không có bằng chứng sinh học nào liên kết hắn với bất kỳ nạn nhân nào. Năm 1987, đội đặc nhiệm đưa ra một quyết định táo bạo và chiến lược. Dưới vỏ đọc của một cuộc rà soát và phỏng vấn lại hồ sơ cũ định kỳ, họ triệu tập Ridgway trở lại. Mục đích chính thức là để làm rõ các chi tiết nhỏ từ lần phỏng vấn đầu tiên. Mục đích không chính thức, nhưng quan trọng nhất là để thu thập mẫu vật sinh học của hắn một cách hợp pháp mà không gây ra sự nghi ngờ. Các thám tử hiểu rằng, bất kỳ sự truy vấn trực tiếp nào về việc lấy mẫu tóc hoặc nước bọt sẽ bị Ridgway từ chối, hoặc sẽ cần một lệnh khám xét, điều mà họ không có đủ căn cứ để xin.
Thay vào đó, họ tiếp cận hắn một cách bình thường. Khi cuộc phỏng vấn kết thúc, một thám tử đã đề nghị Ridgway cung cấp các mẫu vật kiểm soát để so sánh với các sợi tóc và dấu vết dịch cơ thể không xác định được, tìm thấy rải rác trong hàng trăm túi bằng chứng lạnh lẽo của họ. Họ giải thích rằng đây là thủ tục tiêu chuẩn để loại trừ những người đã tiếp xúc ngẫu nhiên với khu vực hoặc các nạn nhân trong quá trình làm việc. Ridgway luôn hợp tác một cách kỳ lạ, đã đồng ý. Hắn đã ký vào mẫu đồng ý một cách dễ dàng. Thám tử đã cẩn thận lấy một số sợi tóc từ da đầu hắn, cần phải đảm bảo có cả nang tóc, dù khi đó họ không chắc chắn tại sao điều đó lại quan trọng. Quan trọng hơn, họ lấy mẫu nước bọt bằng tăm bông sạch. Những mẫu vật này không phải là bằng chứng buộc tội vào năm 1987, chúng chỉ là một vật phẩm trong danh sách kiểm kê, được dán nhãn bằng tên hắn và ngày thu thập. Chúng được xử lý với sự tôn kính gần như tôn giáo. Tóc, nước bọt và các mẫu đối chứng khác của Ridgway được niêm phong trong phong bì giấy, sau đó được đặt cẩn thận vào hộp chứa được kiểm soát nhiệt độ và cuối cùng được chuyển đến một phòng lạnh an toàn tại cơ quan cảnh sát hạt kinh. Đó là một hành động của niềm tin mù quáng vào tương lai. Các thám tử, nhiều người trong số họ đã dành cả đời để theo đuổi cái bóng của kẻ giết người sông Green, biết rằng họ đang cất giữ một viên đạn bạc khoa học. Họ không thể bắn nó ngay bây giờ, nhưng họ đã đảm bảo rằng nó sẽ có sẵn khi công nghệ bắt kịp với nhu cầu công lý của họ. Vụ án chính thức bị đóng băng. Các mẫu vật của Ridgway nằm im lìm trong kho lạnh, trở thành những nhân chứng thầm lặng cho nỗi kinh hoàng đã qua. Cuộc chờ đợi bắt đầu. Các thành viên của đội đặc nhiệm tiếp tục tuần tra và theo dõi Ridgway trong nhiều năm sau đó, biết rằng kẻ đã gây ra tội ác lớn nhất trong lịch sử khu vực vẫn đang đi lại tự do. Công lý đã không bị từ chối, nó chỉ bị trì hoãn, bị nhốt trong kho lạnh, chờ đợi ngày mà những phân tử nhỏ bé trong nang tóc và nước bọt đó cuối cùng sẽ lên tiếng chống lại kẻ thù ác. The silence following 1987 was perhaps the most chilling phase of the Green River saga. The bodies stopped appearing, but the absence of violence did not signal the killer's capture. It merely confirmed his adaptability. Gary Ridgway, having been given a temporary reprieve by the primitive nature of early forensic science, retreated into the camouflage of his ordinary life. He remained a truck painter in the Seattle suburbs, a seemingly average man protected by the decade-long scientific gap that separated him from definitive proof. For years, the Green River Task Force, though officially scaled back, persisted as a haunting sentinel, a skeleton crew guarding the massive, unsolved file, a bureaucratic monument to Beatty's spectral victims. The samples, secured in 1980 Byte under the guise of routine re-evaluation, rested deep within the cold storage of the King County Sheriff's Department. They were more than just biological evidence, they were a bet placed on the future, a hope that technology would one day catch up to the horror. Detectives who had spent their entire careers chasing shadows found themselves relying on a science that had not yet fully matured. The 1990s brought the slow, relentless advance of DNA profiling. What had once been complex and often inconclusive tests requiring large, pristine samples began to evolve into the precise, replicable process of the genetic fingerprint. Every year brought cautious optimism, tempered by the overwhelming reality that Ridgway was free, breathing the same air as the victims' families. The pivot point arrived in the year 2001. Forensic science had finally achieved the necessary level of sensitivity and accuracy. The team overseeing the cold case made the faithful decision to retrieve the evidence. They focused on the earliest, most challenging samples, those collected from the bodies of Wadini Caulfield and Deborah Lynn Bonner, the first victims whose cases had officially launched the Panic of 1982. The goal was to use the newly refined PCR technology, polymerase chain reaction, to amplify the minuscule, degraded DNA evidence recovered from the crime scenes and compare it directly to the saliva and hair samples taken from Gary Ridgway 14 years prior. The result, when it finally arrived, was not a tentative suggestion or a statistical probability. It was an absolute genetic certainty. The evidence matched. The DNA profile linked Gary Leon Ridgway directly and conclusively to the earliest Green River victims and, by extension, to the pattern that had terrorized the Pacific Northwest for 2 decades. The key that had lain dormant in a freezer was finally turned, unlocking the door to a monster who had enjoyed 20 years of complete, undisturbed freedom. On November 30, 2001, Gary Ridgway was arrested while leaving his workplace. The sheer banality of his capture, a simple man walking to his car, stood in stark opposition to the magnitude of the terror he embodied.
He was finally confronted with the reality of his own biology, a betrayal written into his genetic code that the 1980s polygraph had failed to detect. The true, devastating cost of the scientific delay then became painfully clear. If the investigative limitations of the 1980s had not allowed him to walk free after his initial questioning, the dozens of young women murdered between 1985 and 1987, the peak years of the killing spree, might have been spared. For nearly 2 decades, investigators had been haunted by the failure to secure justice, unknowingly allowing the killer to continue his hunting spree until his self-imposed cessation in the late 80s. The subsequent investigation transitioned from a manhunt to a grim process of retrieval and confession. Faced with irrefutable DNA evidence, Ridgway eventually struck a deal, offering to confess and lead authorities to the remaining missing victims in exchange for being spared the death penalty. He led investigators deep into the wilderness, pointing out long-forgotten, overgrown burial sites near the river, under bridges, and in remote sections of the King County forests. He described his methods with the chilling detachment of a hunter recounting his sport, confirming the cold, calculating nature that Ted Bundy had warned them about 2 decades earlier. Ridgway confessed to the murders of 48 women, though investigators estimate his total victim count to be significantly higher. The river, which had held the secrets of the marginalized for so long, finally yielded its monster. The case of the Green River Killer closed not through brilliant detective work in the moment, but through the patient, agonizing wait for the evolution of science. Justice, though delayed for 20 years, arrived as an irrefutable testament to the perseverance of the investigators who had stored those precious few samples, recognizing that the limitations of their present would eventually be overcome by the breakthroughs of the future. The horror was finally contained, but the echo of the lost years and the price paid by the vulnerable women who vanished into the shadow of the Pacific Northwest would forever serve as a scar on the history of American law enforcement.